William James will be fairly smooth, but we will start with some group work actually on William James. We'll start with a question. I'll get to that after I wrap up our conversation on Clifford. I need to say a few more things about his reading. Remember, keep in mind, it is the ethics of belief. He's making a moral claim regarding the assenting to or failing to dissent particular beliefs. This may be the first time you've heard such an idea, or maybe you are, and maybe it is, and you agree with it. Of course, holding beliefs that aren't supported by or even supportable by evidence is not only irrational, you might think, but immoral. Irrational, I think, is easier for us to get a sense of. It's not rational for me to believe something that I have good evidence against. It's not rational for me to fail to believe something for which there is significant evidence in support of it. The question is, though, does it raise to the level of moral concern by just holding a belief? What was the example? What was the thought experiment he starts with? The ship. And somebody briefly tear through that. Yeah, what was the experience? Example.
He was setting, people were going to go set sail on his boat, and he knew it wasn't up to snuff. But he said, no, it's been sailing for quite a while now, so it's totally fine.
Yeah.
And he let the people go.
Yeah, and what happened?
They all died.
Yeah. What does he say? And he got his insurance money when she went down in mid-ocean and told no tales. I don't want to make this comparison to what happened last year with a ship right outside of Santa Barbara. It was a small boat caught on fire. From what I just recently saw, it was only a headline, admittedly, so I apologize, I don't have the details. But there were numerous violations. You know what I'm talking about, this small boat?
Yeah.
20...
It was like a snorkeling boat.
Snorkeling boat, middle of the night, some 20, I don't know how many people, 25 people died?
30.
Was it 30? And apparently there were a number of, violations. You're supposed to get checked or something. What are they called? Regulations. There were violations of regulations. A number of them. So the assumption there is, it seems like something has gone wrong with the owners. Likewise here. Right? And we say, well, yeah, this was bad. He was wrong to not have it checked. Right? He trusted to providence. There's one of the few explicit references to religious ideas. Those who came in a bit late, just see me at the end. I'll make sure to mark you present. Even if you don't feel tardy, you are tardy. It's Van Halen reference, I don't feel tardy. Anyone? Van Halen?
Is that Hot for Teacher? What is that from?
God, that would be awkward if that was the song I chose. I actually don't remember.
Well, that's just
Van
the
Halen.
related song I know.
It's probably that. It's an 80s rock band, and it's not relevant. I'm sorry.
It's still relevant. They're still touring.
What?
Yeah, I'm pretty sure Wolfgang Van Halen
Oh,
is
his
like
son,
the guitarist.
Wolfgang. That's awesome. Wolfgang von Halen, off of Wolfgang von Goethe and Beethoven. All right, the ship sinks. Who would disagree with Clifford here, that person was in the wrong to trust to providence that the ship would be fine? It wasn't overly well built to begin with, he knew that. Clifford wants us to accept that, yeah, that was wrong. What if the ship didn't sink? Why is it still wrong? And do you agree with Clifford on this? This is fundamental to his point. So we don't go this far. If we don't follow him here, it's likely we won't follow him the rest of the way. Is it wrong for him to hold a belief, even though there are no negative consequences in this particular case of holding said belief? Please.
Well, there was a lot of stuff wrong with the ship, and it could have gone down anyway, so the potentiality is there regardless of whether it sinks or not. So just because of that.
Legally, he wouldn't be in trouble, I guess, because nothing happened. Everything's fine. Right?
There's the potential for it to sink. That's why he's in the wrong.
I guess legally too, you can go back to the example I just gave. You violated these regulations, and you pay a fine. Even if nothing bad happens, you still have to pay a fine, I believe, right? So, yeah, very good. Yes?
I was just say there's evidence like supporting that it's like it wasn't okay to like, let out. He just got lucky, so like in the end, you're still making like the same bad decision. You just got lucky.
And getting lucky is not sufficient. We're putting it to justify holding a belief that did not have sufficient evidence for it. Are there other examples you have of people holding beliefs that they may not, at least in the moment, or potentially ever? Let's imagine that's possible. And what does Clifford think about that, by the way? Beliefs and not acting or acting on them.
I just need some clarification
Uh-huh.
on, even if the boat didn't sink,
Mm-hmm.
if he had a thought, if he had a doubt, if there was some sort of an intentional in his mind, then it's still wrong.
But
Is that it or not?
that's it, yes.
Okay.
If he holds the belief that it'll be fine, and yet has no sufficient evidence to support that claim, that belief, that it will be fine, even if it is fine in this particular case, he's still wrong morally speaking. He's holding a belief that doesn't have sufficient evidence for it. That's where the flaw is. Do you agree with that? That it's always, everywhere, for anyone, at any time, no matter what time of day. I'm adding more to it. I just want to be more exact. To believe anything upon insufficient evidence. That's an extremely categorical claim. Actually, you had to end that late.
Just his argument was like about habits, and basically he formed that habit of allowing for that sort of thing to happen. Eventually, in the future, you're gonna like sink the boat.
Yeah, and not only you individually, but your beliefs are not private, he says.
Yeah.
That's an interesting claim. In fact, that may be one of the next things I come to. The question is not whether their belief was true or false, but whether they entertained it on wrong grounds. So I can hold a belief, right, that may turn out to be true, but if I don't have justification for it, if I don't have reasons to support it, then it's merely coincidentally true. This is my problem with multiple choice questions. Do you know the answer because you got it right? You could guess, can you not? That's why multiple choice sucks.
What about like intuition?
I'll talk about that in a moment. That's good. I'll talk about that in a moment. Let me get your question.
I would say it would depend on the situation. So in that case, if the ship sinks, many people will die. But there are other situations where it would not affect other people. Let's say like someone was believing, oh, okay, I'm healthy, and then this guy was had like a disease and he didn't check up on himself, and then he had consequences.
And he doesn't want to know. I think I'm reminded of a Seinfeld episode where George Costanza had a little white dot on his lip, and he thought it could be lupus. Jerry said, "You ought to go get that checked out." He says, "No." Just, if you don't watch Seinfeld, shame on you, first of all. But second of all, this reference might, you get the reference anyway. George is overly hypochondriac, I guess, and he doesn't want to go to the doctor. Because if he goes to the doctor, then he might discover it's lupus. Do you see the reasoning there? If he doesn't go to the doctor, he won't discover that it's lupus. Does that mean it won't be lupus? Somebody's bell rings, showing that I was correct, I guess, in the question. But notice, what does Clifford say about that? You can end up harming yourself there, right? Or you can just get into, even if no disease is there, the negative thing there, the moral dilemma, is habituating yourself, going back to Alex's point of habituation, to accept claims without sufficient evidence. And then we get to the next point. You're likely... It's eventually going to come out in action. Clifford is very similar to James and pragmatism, as we'll see in a moment, in that a belief is only really a genuine belief if it affects your action in some fashion. If it has no effect on your action, then it doesn't make sense to call it a belief. If I claim to be a hardcore determinist, I don't believe in free will, but I continually, daily, hourly act as if I believed in free will, then I don't have the belief in determinism. It doesn't come out in my actions. It's not a genuine, ultimate belief, according to pragmatists. And I think in this Clifford would agree as well. Where was the other question I had, and then I'll come back.
I was just going to say, it was kind of like ignorance is bliss. Like if they
That's what Costanza likes, yeah.
Like if they're like, kind
Yeah.
of like, oh, I don't know, like it won't like if I know, then they'll like think about it and
Well,
they
that's-
like, have the like, obligation to kind of change.
That's a
or
whole
adapt their views.
separate kettle of fish, which I don't know when would be the right time to get to. I mean, there are certain things you don't want to know. It's just clear. I don't want to know when and how I'm going to die. That's what makes capital punishment such a difficult punishment. Because it's not like they come up behind you in the middle of the night sometime, which also maybe that's worse. But you know, right? I don't know which I would prefer if I were on death row, which I wouldn't be because I didn't get caught. All right, sorry. Knowing the time and method of your execution, that's got to be messing with your head. But many theists tell us we all do know we're mortal, we're going to die. We just don't like to think about it. And that raises a lot of concepts and issues that we're going to get back to. Actually, that connects a little bit with the problem of evil. So I want to come back to ignorance as bliss. Don't forget that, but I want to return to that. I don't want to get into it just yet. Yes?
When you're talking about, when you make the statement that is it possible to, or should anyone believe anything with insufficient evidence,
Yeah.
it seems kind of weird, and there seems like a gray area between a belief and a hope. Because it seems like when we were talking about Santa as a kid, it seems like there's sufficient evidence. You saw pictures, you had several people tell you.
Trusted people.
You trusted people, and it seems possible.
Yes.
So it seems that even with the slightest bit of possibility, like let's say I was intently believing that the world was going to end tomorrow, it's a possibility, and let's say that there was like some kind of possible evidence. It's weird to be like, or with the sailor, I believe that's going to happen, or just like, I hope it doesn't happen.
Good. There's a difference between a belief and a hope. Mental states, to use the language in the philosophy, to use the lexicon in the philosophy of language, there's a guy named John Searle who talks about direction of fit. When I have a belief, my web of belief is directed toward the world, toward reality. So reality impinges upon my belief. The direction of fit, actually I've got that backwards, the direction of fit is my belief should cohere with reality. Reality should change my beliefs. My belief should fit with the way the world is. And when the world is changed, my beliefs ought to change to correspond adequately to it. Whereas with something like hope, I want reality to be a particular way. You can call them wishes as well. And in that sense, I try to get the world to fit what I take to be or want or desire. Desires, hopes, wishes are different than beliefs in that sense. Clifford's talking about beliefs.
Yeah, so like with the example of the ship, it started off by saying, I think I remember that he recognized that there was a problem. He's clearly aware that the ship has problems.
It's not over well built, which is an odd phrase. It's not well built.
Right, so
at the first.
There's obviously some kind of underlying belief that something could go wrong.
And it needed repairs.
So, and then he brushes it off, and then it no longer becomes a belief that it's going to.
I see. I see. Very good. I didn't see where you were going with that first. Right, because there's a lot more, he says. Doubts have been suggested to him that possibly she was not seaworthy. These doubts preyed upon his mind and made him unhappy. He thought that perhaps he ought to have her thoroughly overhauled and refitted, even though this should put him to great expense. Now, this doesn't happen in reality, does it? Companies would never let their products out into the world without... Do I need to finish the sentence? Yes. And actually, let me, Benjamin had a question earlier before I forget, and I'll come back to you.
I was sort of interested in the ship question. It was like he has these doubts. He has these reasonable reasons for doubting that it's seaworthy. But what was it? He trusts in providence. Like when he sends it out, he trusts in providence.
He would put his trust in providence with a capital P, which could hardly fail to protect all these unhappy families that were leaving their fatherland to seek better times elsewhere. In other words, how could God allow them to die? We'll get to that with the problem of suffering later. So, go on.
So, I had this a second. It was he has the knowledge it's going to fail.
It could fail. It might.
Fail. So even if he doesn't, is he wrong? Well, I think it's when you frame the belief as it is, it's like, well, he's putting his responsibility off on something else. But if you took it at like face value, I guess you could see it's like what he's actually saying is, I'm willing to gamble people's lives for profit. And if the question is that immoral? I think it's more obvious, but I guess this is sort of an example of how someone could maybe use beliefs as an opiate, like
any kind of beliefs, or specifically religious beliefs.
It could be any kind of beliefs, I think, but religious beliefs, sure. I mean, in this case,
yeah, an opiate.
It's to assuage his fears that he's believing this, right?
Assuage to kind of deal with, these are fears I need to deal with. I don't have the money to pay for the ship.
Yeah.
And I don't have time. He ends the whole reading with, who has time to justify with rational evidence all our beliefs? And what does he end with? For the person, he imagines somebody saying that. Who has the time to look into all the relevant data to justify our beliefs?
You shouldn't have time to believe.
Then you shouldn't have time to believe. That's exactly right. He says that, but says one, I am a busy man. I have no time for the long course of study which would be necessary to make me in any degree a competent judge of certain questions, or even able to understand the nature of the arguments. Well, then he should have no time to believe. That's quite nice. You shouldn't hold, in other words, you ought to withhold judgment. To use the religious language, you ought to remain agnostic, right? James will have a response to this, agnostic. Because if you assent to something and withhold and maintain a belief, it will eventually, here's a debatable point, in fact I have a question there, it's a debatable point, but he says it will eventually come out in action. It's not actually a legitimate belief of yours if it never comes out in any kind of action whatsoever. Do you understand? Beliefs are that which affect our behaviors. And he says, and no man's belief in any case is a private matter, which concerns himself alone. In particular, any kinds of what he'll call fatal superstitions. And he would, Richard Dawkins, who I'm certain has quoted Clifford on more than one occasion, would agree with Clifford on this. In fact, he calls it child abuse. This is an extreme view, perhaps, but he's focusing on a particular area. In particular, with respect to hell. If I teach my children about hell, and let's say my particular version, and not everyone's conception of hell is going to be the same within Christianity, within specific divisions of Christianity. Some don't even believe in hell, in fact, and we'll talk more about that later, of course. But if I believe in hell, and I teach my children about hell, and I teach my children, this is what Dawkins is talking about, that you have to believe the right things, and believe in the right person as God, to make it to heaven and not hell. And then my son asks, or my daughter asks, well, what about little Timmy? It's always little Timmy. I don't know why I keep using it. What about little Timmy who's Jewish or agnostic? Or it's weird to talk about children as agnostic, but not to talk about them as Jewish or Catholic. Actually, Dawkins talks about that too. My daughter Lola, she's 6. She's an epistemic mereologist. The hell is that, you might ask? I'm joking, but she's whatever I am. Let's imagine I happen to be one of those types of people. I'm an empiricist. And here's my daughter Lola, 6, also an empiricist. We find that weird. She's a capitalist too. She's a little capitalist pig. No. Sorry. But Dawkins says, we seem to have no trouble saying, here are my kids, they're Catholics. They're like 2, 3, 4. How are they that already? We don't say that with anything else, or rarely. Judaism is a little different because there's more to it than just a particular faith, so that may make more sense in that sense. But what is he talking about? Child abuse? There's a link to him saying this. Well, imagine I tell my son that, your friends are going to suffer eternal hell because they fail to believe the same way that we do. And he expands on that. Clifford finds those to be fatal superstitions in general. But Clifford seems to go even further. He's not specifically talking about that kind of belief. He's saying any belief at all held without sufficient evidence is unethical, because it violates our duty to humankind. It perpetuates a naivete, a credulousness, a foolishness, a gullibility, and it will take us back to the times of savagery, as he puts it. Or, I think he uses the word savagery, right? Believing things without sufficient evidence is going to take us back to the Stone Age, something like that. What does he mean by sufficient evidence? Did you ask that as you were reading through this? He says sufficient evidence. Did you think to yourself, what's that?
Yeah.
And did you think to yourself, why isn't that section included in the textbook of him saying what sufficient evidence is? To want to know more about that, I did add the full text, and where you get at his conception of sufficient evidence, he talks about it in terms of the weight of authority, which is on page 9 of the suggested reading now, which is his full document. It's not that much longer. I don't know why they cut out that much. I was displeased with that. But just to give you the overview, typically instances in courtrooms, in scientific endeavors, and of course it's going to be different. The degree of rationality, the level of conditions or the criteria for believing something are going to be different depending upon the context, the situation. In a courtroom, right, the bar might be beyond a reasonable doubt, right? How do we know? In fact, look at what's going on. I suspect right now, you can look online if you wanted, don't do it though, and see what's going on with the impeachment trial. One side's putting forth the evidence, the other side is either refuting the evidence or arguing that evidence doesn't rise to the level of an impeachable offense, for example. That level, that bar, is going to be different, right? With respect to, let's say, mathematical justification. You wouldn't say to your teacher, the answer's 10. I know, but look, I put 9. I'm 1 off. I mean, that's not going to work. But you can in other disciplines, not because the other disciplines are less than, but their criteria of justification are going to be different. Aristotle makes this point in his opening work in the Ethics. We're going to see a question a second ago. Yeah?
What about kind of like beliefs about oneself? Like, what do you say about that?
Like, I believe I'm kind,
Yeah.
type of thing.
Yeah. Like,
I'm not angry. You could be wrong. I say that to my son. Doesn't get it. He doesn't get that he can appear and be in a bad mood or angry and be mistaken about how he's feeling. So you can be mistaken about your own presumptions about your mental states. That's why we have psychiatrists. Because they, which is a kind of weird idea, might be able to understand what's going on in your head in a better way than you do. So are you asking in the sense that what would Clifford say about beliefs about myself, because they're subjective, they're presumed to be...
where would you find the evidence for like a belief?
Yeah, it depends on the kind of belief. My tooth hurts. That sound like a totally non sequitur. Let's imagine I say my tooth hurts, and then you say, no, it doesn't. That's a weird thing for you to say. Dentists have to deal with this, as you know, right? Somebody's applying anesthesia, and the drill is about to touch the teeth, but hasn't yet, and you cry out in pain. From the dentist's perspective, you cry out as if in pain because you haven't been touched yet. So you're not in pain. You're mistaken. No, that's wrong. The dentist, when they say that, are wrong. You are not mistaken about being in pain. You might be mistaken about what caused the pain you feel. I don't think you could be mistaken about feeling pain. You can be mistaken about where the pain came from. You can be mistaken about what mood you're in, about what emotions you're feeling. There's a whole thing called emotional intelligence, right? And you can be mistaken about those kinds of things. How something tastes to you, as much as I tell my kids, you like broccoli, you've had it before, you enjoy it. And they say, no, I don't. You like waffles. How are you not eating waffles anymore? Having children, let me just stop for a moment and jump to the problem of evil really quickly. It's impossible to feed them. What are you supposed to do? Okay, so sufficient evidence. There's this. This is where he ends with, then you should have no time to believe. to believe, he's got a problem. It is wrong everywhere for anyone to believe anything upon insufficient evidence. And the obvious problem that he didn't think about, and the followers after him who referenced some of his work, called logical positivists, something we cover in the 203 class. A logical positivist around the 1920s, 30s. There's somebody who says a claim can only be meaningful if it is verifiable, which is basically kind of what he's saying. But this claim was already in trouble. It's wrong always, everywhere, and for anyone to believe anything upon insufficient evidence. What might you ask of Clifford?
How does he believe that?
Yes. What's the sufficient evidence for that claim? Now, he gives reasons. Are you satisfied by the reasons? Are there sufficient reasons to hold on to that maxim? And I'll give you one contemporary example where we might say, you know what, Clifford's right, because here's a terrible example of believing something without sufficient evidence. And it's The Secret. I like to mention this because it's just so fascinating. It sounds great. And part of it is, it's one of those things that takes something that's probably true and expands on it to the point where that's not true anymore. Or it takes a partial truth. It borrows from, has anyone heard of The Secret?
Yeah.
It borrows from quantum mechanics. I say borrow from. I mean that extraordinarily loosely. They have, Rhonda Byrne does, and there's a video, there's tens of millions of copies of her video, DVDs, and books called The Secret have been sold. And it's basically ask, believe, receive. You want that BMW? Ask for it. Believe it. Get your vision board out. Think about it. Think about it. You don't want to get bills in the mail? I'm starting to sound like a...
It's all market.
Yeah, no. Yeah, motivational speaker. And I lost my... I shouldn't have stopped in the mid-sentence. I've lost my mojo. You want to get rid of that cancer? You think about it positively. Positive thoughts will go out and attract positive energy. It is called the law of attraction, and she says it works 100% of the time. If you have positive thinking, positive things will happen to you. You can get that BMW. You can lose that weight. You can find that spouse. You can get rid of your cancer. That one should stop you. And it did stop Oprah, but it took her a while. She was on Oprah 3 times. Oprah loved her, and there's a lot to love about the message. Positive thinking is positive. And that's about where she should have stopped. It's not a secret, by the way. Christians, Stoics, Aristotelian virtue ethicists, contemporary psychologists, neurobiologists, and so forth all argue that positive thinking is a good thing. But no one that I know of says that positive thinking can cure cancer. It may help with pain, just as any placebo effect might. But positive thinking alone does not get rid of cancer. Notice, though, if I say, wait a minute, little Timmy, little Timmy, this is an awful example, but she brought it on herself, had cancer, was positive, loved people, felt for sure he was going to kick it, and then he didn't. What can she say to that? Does that falsify her hypothesis about The Secret? No. All she has to say was, they didn't truly believe. That's an implication of her view. She doesn't say that explicitly, but that's a logical and moral implication. There's no way of falsifying it. There's no way of showing, hey, here's a counterexample to it. No, that's not a counterexample because that person was really not having positive thoughts. Why? Because it works 100% of the time. So this person died, they weren't thinking positively. That's somewhat medieval in nature. I don't think she intended it to be that way, but that's a consequence of it. This is the key we want to get to for next discussion after our group work. As for skeptics, Byrne says, I wanted to share this gift with every person. It's up to them to choose to believe. That's a question I want you to consider. Because if one is capable of choosing to believe, then perhaps Clifford might be mistaken. Clifford's claim is too extreme. Which brings me to our quick breaking point. I am going to break you into groups. A little bit about William James while you're getting that stuff down. Okay, there he is. That's what he looks like. It's always good to see what the philosophers look like so you know why they think the way that they do.
Yes.
He has less of a beard than Clifford, so what does that tell you?
Less food in the beard.
It tells you absolutely nothing. I'm sorry I went that route. But it's nice to know what they look like, so that's what he looked like. James was, he's the brother of of Henry James, the author. And his sister also, whose name escapes me now, went into professional work as well, became pretty well known. Henry James probably is more well known for writing, although I think William James is a better writer. No offense to his brother. He started studying science first. His background is in science. In the empirical sciences, trying to discover things about the physical world. He even went on excursions into South America, following the Amazon to accumulate data about certain things. And he got so sick of the mundane, constant seeking of facts, compiling data. Now, he doesn't disagree with the scientific method. He has no problem with science. He just thinks that, like we talked about the first day or second day, they have different areas of interest than do, say, questions of morals, questions of theology, questions of meaning and purpose. He ended up going in to study psychology. In fact, he has a book on basically it's a textbook on psychology that I think is still seen as usable in anyone psychology major? You've heard of William James in psychology? No? Your teachers are derelict in their duties. He is fundamental to the branch of I would call psychology, by the way, the philosophy of mind, with a lot of extra data. I don't know psychologists like that. In any case, he is fundamental to psychology as a branch of study. But also he's well-known, probably the most well-known American philosopher. And what is fascinating about that is that he had no formal training in philosophy. He studied on his own. He's one of those few self-made thinkers in this area, like Lincoln with respect to law, I guess. And he became, and I think in many cases rightfully so, an extremely well-respected philosopher in his own right. In his book, or in the reading that you have for today, The Will to Believe, is a response to what he calls the enfant terrible. It's French, so that's how you say it. Anyone speak French? Yeah, I said it right. Did I?
Very good.
Yeah. Très bien. Très bien. If you don't know how to say French, speak French, just do not enunciate the third of every single word. Just leave it unenunciated, and then you're like, yeah, you got it. A third of that language is silent, is it not? No.
Say so.
Oui, oh, no. What is oh, or? Okay, forget it. It's a waste of our time. Sorry. I'm not denigrating the language. English has its problems. We spell knife with a K, after all. What the hell's wrong with us? It's a stupid language. In the background, this is his reply. James is replying to Clifford. He was mocked, James was, for this title, The Will to Believe. Oh, really? We can just choose to believe whatever we want? Not surprisingly, that's not what James said. But he was mocked for that, much like John Stuart Mill before him was mocked for his utilitarianism. Oh, you think we should just be like pigs and accumulate as many pleasures as possible? Not what utilitarianism is. That's called, in logic, a straw man fallacy, where you misrepresent somebody's argument and you attack the misrepresentation. And I think Clifford had a lot of those detractors who didn't follow his argument with respect to what he means by the will to believe. He later said, I wish I'd called it the right to believe. That has a different connotation. Although I want to come back to our discussion, Jacob, you were talking about hope and faith and belief and the differences between those mental states. That's going to be significant with James. All right, some background. In his work, what pragmatism means. James is a pragmatist. I touched on this with Clifford. I think Clifford is ultimately in that mode of thinking as well. Pragmatism is the first school of philosophy that came out of and became world respected of America in the 1890s. There's Josiah Royce, Charles Sanders Peirce. It's Peirce in particular, who is an American logician and philosopher who started pragmatism. James borrows from Peirce. And in fact, Peirce doesn't quite go as far as James does. Peirce doesn't like James's acceptance of a lot of the tender-minded ideas, as we'll see in a moment. Peirce didn't like that. Peirce preferred pragmatism to be similar to what Clifford argues. Right? A belief is true based upon the practical, pragmatic consequences of holding it. What are the cash payouts? And are there ways of supporting it, justifying it? For Peirce, it was science. James might accuse him of scientism in some cases when he went too far. Peirce later changed his term pragmatism to pragmaticism because he didn't like the way James adopted his views. And so he wanted to make sure he was distinguished from James. So he came up with a word that was so ugly nobody would steal it. Pragmaticism. In any case, James starts his distinction that's necessary for our understanding of where he's coming from, I think, by looking at breaking up the world very generally here, and perhaps overgenerally, into two different camps, the tender-minded and the tough-minded. Intellectualistic versus sensationalistic. Sensationalistic, he really means senses. That's kind of confusing there. Reliance on or emphasis on the senses. Emphasis on the material, physical stuff. The tough-minded are typically more pessimistic as opposed to optimistic. They're more in line with hardcore sciences, let's say. And in most cases, the presumption is the hardcore sciences are not religious. Irreligious is a kind of weird term. Although, what was it? Who was the comedian that did a documentary called
Mayor.
Religulous?
John,
Was it Religulous?
yeah, it's Real Time with Bill
Maher. Bill
Yeah,
Maher.
Bill Maher.
That couldn't have been the name of the movie, though.
Yeah,
like ridiculous, it's religulous.
Yeah.
Very confusing. In any case, the tough-minded tend to be fatalistic. Notice he distinguishes those who believe in free will with those who are fatalistic. Deterministic might be a better term there. Fatalism implies a kind of intentionality, personification of the fates, as if it's fated for something to happen the way it does. There's no free will there. No matter what you do, it's fated. You're doomed to die in a particular way in the movie. It's like 8 of them. It's the Final Destination. I've not seen any of them, but I'm sure they're all worth our time. And in each case, there's fatalism, I guess. I don't know why I use that as a reference. I've never actually seen it, but it sounds like it's a kind of fatalism. And then there's pluralism and monism. I'm not going to talk about that now. We'll talk about pluralistic versus exclusivism within religious beliefs. Is there only one way to salvation, or are there a plurality? That's a different context here. This is a metaphysical pluralism. Is there only one stuff? Is everything unified? Is everything ultimately one, and it just appears to be plural, but we're mistaken? You see that in a lot of, for instance, Advaita Vedanta in Hinduism sees things as monistic. There's one. You see that in ancient Greek philosophy with people like Parmenides. And he puts the word dogmatical here, which is an odd word. Dogmatic, that's almost always seen as negative. But so is skeptical if it's taken to its extreme. I don't think Clifford justifies the negative interpretation of skeptical as an extreme skeptic, the kind of skeptic that Bertrand Russell would refer to as useless, the skeptic who says knowledge is impossible. That's not what Clifford says. And too much of this leads to that kind of uselessness. If I say knowledge is impossible, what should you say to me? Yes. And what do I say? I'd have to say I don't know. So then I'd have to back up and say, you know what, my first claim about knowledge being impossible, I no longer hold that, because I don't know. In fact, I shouldn't even be able to open my mouth. The moment I start speaking, I have refuted myself. I am a skeptic. Knowledge is impossible. Really? How do you know what those words mean? Jackass. There aren't many extreme skeptics, okay, of that sort. And I think Clifford would be more of a, he's closer to tough-minded, but I think this is a too extreme of a false dichotomy. And James is aware of that to an extent. He's caricaturizing for purpose here. He gives as an example of somebody who's an optimist, an extreme optimist. You can see Whitman here. He's smiling there. It's hard to tell. People didn't smile back then for pictures because I think they took so long. You'd have to just sit there. And you wouldn't say smile and then take the picture. It would be, okay, don't move. It'll be done in about 10 minutes. So he held that pose. I'm not going to read that, but it's very positive. Look at the bottom. I praise with electric voice, for I do not see one imperfection in the universe. Have you not opened your eyes, sir? And look at that beard. What does that beard tell you? Nothing at all. Same with the other beards. There's a test there. One's appearance is irrelevant to their capacity to reason. Just keep that in mind. And what about this dude? Arthur Schopenhauer. He's tough-minded. Let me give you some key points of his philosophical views. Life is pointless suffering. Life is a mistake. These are basically quotes. Life, this world, is the worst possible world. That's going to be relevant when we get into the problem of evil. Famously, Wilhelm Gottfried Leibniz says this is the best of all possible worlds. Schopenhauer disagrees. I think he's smiling there, but I can't tell if it's an ironic, sarcastic smile. He looks kind of cool there, doesn't he? Isn't that a good? That's a no.
I mean, the veins popping out are really
He's-
appropriate.
yes,
If I
sure.
believe those things, my blood vessels
Yeah,
would be...
that's true. He is furious. We would all have been better off never having been born. Doesn't he make you want to read his material?
No.
He has.
Great material.
He's good. He's a good philosopher. He's a great philosopher. As a person, a human being, I think he did once throw his what's it called? Landlady down the stairs. I don't recall why, but I think he did that. Not because of any of this. Or maybe she disagreed. You think all life is suffering? That seems wrong. Really? Let's see what you think now. So is it a false choice? Is it a false choice, a false dichotomy? Is it setting up erroneously two opposites in which we kind of leave out a possible middle ground? James seems to push for the middle ground. It would contradict the very spirit of life to say that our minds must be indifferent and neutral in questions like that of the world's salvation. Anyone who pretends to be neutral writes himself down here as a fool and a sham. That's interesting. Are you concerned about salvation? Are you concerned about meaning and purpose and divinity or non-divinity or origins of morality and so forth in this world? If you say no, you're not, well, he thinks you're pretending. I don't know. I don't know if that's true. But he certainly says it. He says similar things. No one can live an hour without both facts and principles. Here he's showing that the tender-minded and the tough-minded are both something that we each, in varying degrees, appeal to. The tough-minded just tend to be more closer to that column I mentioned. Tender-minded, much more close to. It's not an absolute distinction. He finds the two extremes problematic, though. If you have too much of one of those. Too much tender-mindedness is a problem. Too much hard-mindedness is a problem as well. We need to find something that is in between that. We want to be able to have principles that are logical, that are idealistic, in fact, but we also need facts. Another way of saying is we need science, but we also need, I might say, philosophy. Theology is another term he uses as well. Notice the distinction he makes. This is all background. We'll get into the reading now in a moment. He worries about scientism. Remember what scientism was? It's not science. It is the overemphasis on the benefits of science. It is the presumption that science can answer any and all human questions. Yeah.
Oh, I was just going to say, in the reading, it says, science herself consults her heart when she lays it down that the infinite ascertainment of fact and correction of false belief are the supreme goods for man.
That's a weird sentence.
Well,
That sounds like what we talked about before, that science is itself a faith. It's not what he wants to say there, but I think you're right. That may be
I don't
where
think
the
that's
term
what
scientism would come in. I think that's right. A priorism, in Latin, a priori means prior to experience. It's a kind of reasoning that a lot of philosophers use when they engage in metaphysical speculation that don't rely on scientific data. And so in both cases, you see two extreme camps. There's science that deals with empirical, what we can see, feel, hear, taste, and touch, and study and manipulate. But then there's a priorism that is abstraction worship, right? Abstracting away from the physical world. And here's the connection. What you want, he says, is a philosophy that will not only exercise your powers of intellectual abstraction, but that will make some positive connection with this actual world. There's the key. Actual world of finite human lives. If your theology or philosophy is so abstract that it has nothing to do with this real world situation, if you are, in Marx's terms, merely theorizing about the world, not attempting to change it, well, then it's just mental masturbation, as Marx puts it. James would agree. If your science is purely abstracting away and attempting to find universal laws, ignoring the fact of subjectivity, of conscious beings living in the real world, then it doesn't have anything to offer them. It doesn't bake bread, is a phrase he actually uses. If your philosophy doesn't bake bread, then what use is it to us? Science, he says, can tell us what exists, but what else can it give us? And it's related to the quote, I think, you were mentioning before. We mentioned scientism before. Not all knowledge is measurable. Not all what is important is measurable. To borrow from Einstein, I'm borrowing from him, not James. That would be an anachronism. Actually, no, they overlapped. James died in 1910. Einstein was around and writing 1905. I like what he says. Not everything that can be counted counts. And not everything that counts can be counted. That's really broad. It's one of those, might have become now a cliche, because so many people have said it before. But I think you get what he's trying to say here. Science tries to count things. James was a little bit annoyed with that constant merely accumulation of facts and counting things, which is insufficient to give one's life purpose. Accumulation of facts certainly doesn't give us wisdom, much less form us as human beings. This takes us to the crux of the argument now. His pragmatism is a kind of middle ground, he hopes, between hardcore science, tough-mindedness, and a tender-minded theology, religion, belief. It is not one can choose to believe whatever the hell one wants. It is not the secret. It is not Rhonda Byrne saying, ask, believe, receive. You want to be able to fly? Well, believe it. Obviously, that's not going to happen. There's got to be conditions. One should be able to choose to believe. Choose to believe. He agrees with Rhonda Byrne's phrase, but under important and very narrow constraints. You have the right to believe. It's unnecessary. You have the right to believe if conditions are met. If the options of your belief have to do with living forced and momentous options, and those options can't be determined on purely intellectual grounds by themselves. Put another way, if I'm confronted with a dilemma, do I choose A or do I choose B? And logic and reason, science, evidence, empirical support, and so forth, on either side are insufficient for me to decide. And it's a genuine option. And a genuine option is one that is living forced and momentous. Then I should have the right to believe what I want. I should have the right to believe that which will be beneficial to me. That's actually a very narrow constraint. It's not saying believe whatever you want. Because if I have two opinions, if I have two viewpoints, and one of them is the earth flat or is it round? Well, I can't decide. James would say, yes, you can. There's significant evidence that the world is spherical. You don't get to choose to decide that it's round, that it's flat. There's too much evidence, intellectual grounds to make the case. Let me just end with this. Unfortunately, I'm going to have to continue this at the outset, at the beginning of next class, which is okay because it does still has us within the same realm when we look at the groundlessness of belief by Norman Malcolm, a little more complex of a reading. But let me just end with this. The next president of the United States will be an independent. Can you imagine believing that? Is that a belief that's open to you? Is it, as he puts it, a live option? He uses the example of electricity. It's got power in it. Could you imagine? Some of you may even vote for an independent, right? It's a live option. However, me, your professor, It is not a live option for me to be president for this reason here.
Sorry.
I'm sorry, is there a joke in there? We'll just end with that then. Come back next time. I'll continue this discussion. Make sure you do the reading, and I think next time you've got, I forgot what's there. It's either a quiz or a discussion questions for the next reading. Keep up with those. Enjoy the lovely weather. It's